I get to welcome everybody. I also want to flag that we are co-sponsoring this event with other partners. So the Center for Jewish Studies and the Magnus Collection of Jewish Art and Life are also partnering. This event really crosses all of our interests in so many different ways. It crosses actually other interests as well. So please recognize that this is a shared or partnered event. So now I get to welcome Professor Hana Crone up. She is going to be introducing our distinguished speaker tonight, and it makes perfect sense since she is a colleague of hers in comparative literature. Hana Crone is professor of modern Hebrew, Yiddish, and comparative literature at UC Berkeley. She and Robert Elter together really shaped the Berkeley School for Hebrew Literature here and have really over many decades crafted an amazing program in Hebrew literature, comparative literature, and students who are now distinguished professors elsewhere around the country. Her area of specializations include modernism in Hebrew, Yiddish and English poetry, translation studies, literary historiography, gender studies, literature and linguistics, many other topics, and she is also the recipient of several awards in her field and many, many books. And I'll leave it at that, but I welcome Hana Crone up here to introduce Mikhal Dekel.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. It gives me great pleasure to introduce my friend Mikhal, Professor Dekel, whom I first told, I think exactly a year ago, when she hosted me in New York, that, you better fasten your seatbelt. This book is going to be a sensation, and indeed it is proving to be. It's had an amazing reception, even though the official publication date was only October 1st. It's already been reviewed in the New York Times. A review is coming up in the BBC Women's Hour, an interview and a review in The Guardian, et cetera, et cetera. And we are fellow Haifa natives. Okay, so here's the official intro. Mikhal Dekel is professor of English at the City College of New York, a professor of Middle Eastern Studies at the CUNY Graduate Center, and the director of CCNY's Rifkin Center for the Humanities and the Arts. She's the recipient of numerous awards, including fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Mellon Foundation, and the Lady Davis Foundation, and the author of two earlier monographs, The Universal Jew, Modernity, Masculinity, and the Zionist Moment from 2011, and the Hebrew book Oedipus in Kishinev from 2014, in addition to numerous articles and blogs. Today she will talk to us about her new book, Tehran Children, a Refugee Odyssey, just published by Norton, and it's no small feat for an academic to be published by Norton. The book has already received great reviews, as I told you, but I want to just read you two excerpts by really famous and insightful academics, authors who write about similar subjects. So this is Samuel Moyn, who's a Yale professor of history and the author of Not Enough Human Rights in an Unequal World. In this brilliantly conceived narrative, Mikhal Dekel reconstructs her father's and grandmother's circuitous journeys by land and sea through Iran on the way from Poland to Palestine in the years of the Holocaust, retracing their lives as she lives her own. In turn, she illuminates a series of unexpected places absent from many maps of the refugee experience of the era, a striking book. And finally, Tara Zara, the author of The Great Departure, Mass Migration from Eastern Europe and the Making of the Free World, writes, Tehran Children is a gripping account of Holocaust survival unlike any other. Blending the genres of memoir, history, and travelogue, Mikhal Dekel traces and, where possible, follows her father's wartime footsteps across thousands of miles from Poland to Soviet Uzbekistan, Tehran, and Palestine, combining the empathy of a daughter with the insight of a scholar. She recovers not only her father's odyssey, but that of hundreds of thousands of Jews who survived the war in harsh exile in the Soviet Union and Central Asia. This is one of the greatest, largely untold stories of the Second World War. As the daughter of Holocaust survivors whose entire family was killed, but they managed to survive by escaping to Central Asia, I can't wait to hear you. Mikhal Dekel, bevakasha.
Thank you, Hana, so much for this wonderful introduction, and thank you, Rebecca, for inviting me, and thank you all for coming. I understand there are the Pritchett lectures, is that right? Or some very important lectures tonight happening at Berkeley, and you chose to be here, so I'm very grateful. So before I start, so Hana alluded to the fact that, so I published this book a month ago, and I'm an academic, and those of you who are academics know that we write in libraries and hope 10 people will read our book, and all of a sudden the book came out and is getting reception beyond academia. So my publisher then said, "You have no presence in social media. This is horrible. Where is your Twitter following? Where is your, this is," so I ask you to follow me on Twitter. This is my Twitter account. And if you want to buy the book, we're not selling books tonight, but it's available everywhere in every form, on Amazon and all the bookstores and so on. So that's all I'll say for that kind of direct self-promotion. But it will help me if you follow me on Twitter. Let's see. I began this book 10 years ago, and actually a friend of mine is here who talked to me about it 10 years ago, and I said, "Oh, I found these photos of my father." And I was going to write a book about a man with whom I grew up, who I saw every morning and night and weekends for the first 18 years of my life and more, but about whom I actually knew very little. He was enigmatic, depressive, slightly angry, remote person, my father, and I didn't really know much about him and nothing about his past. I knew a few things. I knew that he was born in a Polish town called Ostromazowiecka. I couldn't even point to it on a map, but I knew the name of the city. I knew that he came to what was then British-controlled Palestine with a group of children called Yaldei Tehran, or Tehran children, in Israel. I did not think of my father, nor did he present himself as a Holocaust survivor. We never attended any commemorations. We didn't speak about it, and to me, he was just kind of an Israeli man. So, and I'm an English professor, so I'm not a historian per se, although I've now become one and I have the stamp of the historians. But in 2007, I'm talking to a colleague of mine. My colleague is an Iranian-American writer. And he says to me, "Hey, you know anything about kids who were Jewish refugees in Tehran?" And I say, "Well, as a matter of fact, I do." It turns out, if you remember, 2007 were the years of Iranian Prime Minister Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, who is a Holocaust denier, and there was a lot of talk about Iran's complicity during the war, complicity with the Nazis, and so on. And so some Iranian writer wrote an article in Iran that said, "Hey, not only were we not complicit, but we saved Jewish children." So my colleague said, is this true? I said, I know my father was in Tehran. I don't know if you saved him. And he asked me questions. I didn't know much more about how he got there and so on. And that became the beginning of this book, really. But the book that I ended up writing ended up being not just about my father, and not even just about these Tehran children, which were a group of just under 1,000 Jewish children who came to Palestine through Iran, but about 250,000 Polish Jews, in fact, about most Polish Jews who survived the Holocaust, which is kind of astonishing, right? And so this is like maybe my 7th or 8th talk, and almost before each talk, the person who's organizing calls me and said, can you go over the numbers again? Because they don't really get it. But the fact is that, to be very crude about it, there were roughly 3.5 million Jews in Poland before the war. Of these, 10% survived, so about 350,000. And of these 350,000, 250,000 more or less survived in Central Asia, in the Middle East, and India. So I ended up, and so I'm writing the story of most survivors who actually were not recognized as survivors. They weren't, in 1952, there was a reparation agreement between Israel and Germany. These people were not part of the reparation agreement, so they did not receive reparations. They were not commemorated, and they were not studied. I mean, if those of you who are in the field know that in the past 3 decades, there's been tremendous research about the Holocaust, as well as a representation in popular culture and movies and so on. But this story has somehow fallen off the map. So my book became the story of these refugees of the East, and I think it's going to be, I'm sure, I mean, in fact, I know that other people are working on this, and I'm sure it's going to be, other people will be writing about this as well. But it is kind of astonishing. I mean, I'm actually working with the Holocaust Museum in Washington now they're going to be having an event for this book in June, but they're collecting the artifacts of these survivors who all have artifacts, and many of them are writing me now, and they're saying, I have like the memoirs, and I have photos, and I have letters, and those have not been collected in any organized way. That has been quite something. And at the same time, the book remains, I hope, an intimate memoir of my father as well. So it really tries to do 2 things. I mean, it's a big historical book with footnotes and tremendous research, really a lot of work. But it's also, I would say, a 2nd-generation memoir. It's a 2nd-generation memoir of a daughter who had a father who had the symptoms of a survivor without having the story of the survivor. And so I wrote that story as well, his story. So what I'd like to do in the next, I don't know, I guess 30 minutes or so, or a little bit more, is to describe to you the fate of these refugees who have fallen off the map of Holocaust study, and also to describe to you my own journey in their footsteps, as you read as Hana read you Tara Zera's description or blurb of the book, and the book does combine. It's a history, but it's also about the present, how these refugees are remembered in all these places that I travel to. So I'd like us to contemplate the fate of these 250,000 people, really, by imagining 2 children, 12 and 8. These 2 children are, and we are in August 1939. They're siblings, they live in a country that has the largest Jewish population in Europe, Poland. They live in a city where 30% of the residents are Jewish, 60% during their parents' times. It was a very Jewish city. Their family is one of 2 largest wealthiest, oldest families in town. When I'm talking among the Polish Christians and Jews. This family has been in this town for 8 generations. So I was able to trace that. The girl, and you already, I think, can guess that this is my father, Hanania Title, and his sister Regina, and behind them are their parents, Uchela and Zindel. Regina, the girl, has never left her hometown. Hanan, my father, left his hometown once for a tonsillectomy in Warsaw, which is 60 miles away. Now let us imagine them 3 years later. Obviously, I don't have a photo of them, but this is what the scene looked like. They are this is August 1942. They are disembarking on the shores of Pahlavi, which is a port town in northern Iran on the Caspian Sea. They are 5,000 miles away from home. And let me see if this works. But as you can see, so look up, so that's Ostromozowiecka, Poland. They've gone all the way to Arkhangelsk and then down through, basically across the entire Soviet Union from north to south, through Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, crossing the Caspian Sea, and now they're in Bandar Pahlavi. They are, sorry, they weigh less than they did 3 years earlier. They have been refugees for 3 years. They're without they're without parents or any adult protectors. In a few weeks, they're collected into a Jewish home, children's home in Tehran. This is, it's called a home, but it's really a tent camp. It's a Jewish children's tent camp, which is inside a much larger Polish tent camp, Polish refugee camp in Tehran. This is inside a former Air Force base, Iranian Air Force base in Tehran. These children, they arrive in two sort of shipments. One is in March 1942 and one is in August 1942. My father arrives in August 1942. A month later is Yom Kippur. And these children walk to synagogues in Tehran. This is the synagogue that they walk to. This is a picture. This synagogue is still the same. It has remained the same. It's called Chaim and Daniel Synagogue, and if you those of you who read Hebrew, this is the Torah ark. It says Bet HaKnesset HaYudim HaEropim, the synagogue of the European Jews. So this was actually a part of an existing synagogue in Tehran that was cordoned off for the European refugees who were in Tehran. And I have, I'm not going to read now, but there's a very, very moving scene in which is described in somebody's memoir, basically, of these children being brought into the synagogue in Tehran, and the local people everybody starts crying. They see these children in rags and so on, and it's a very moving scene. And also an interesting scene in terms of the meeting of these two communities of basically Iranian Jews who've never seen European Jews, and of course vice versa. So how do they get from Poland to Tehran, from Ostromozowiecka to Tehran? So the very, very quick history lesson. 1939, Poland is partitioned. As we know, Poland is occupied. It's partitioned between Germany and the Soviet Union. By early 1940, 1.5 million Polish Jews, so almost half, live within Soviet borders. So this is Warsaw, this is Białystok, and people either flee from this side to this side, as my family did, or they were lived in those towns and they fell under Soviet occupation. Of these people, about a third get exiled to the Soviet interior. They get deported we can talk about it wide later, but it can complicate reasons, but they get deported this is, I'm sorry this map is so small, but these are basically all the places where people get deported. So really it's everywhere. They get deported into the Soviet interior from north to south. Most of them to what are called special settlements. These are actually what they get deported in. I don't know if people have read Solzhenitsyn, right? If you read it, you remember Solzhenitsyn talks about red cows, these train cars that can go anywhere in the Soviet Union. They get deported in very, very harsh conditions, and conditions that are really similar to the deportations to the death camps, in boarded up trains with no food, with little water. You put on a train, and the train goes, and maybe 2 weeks later you're dumped somewhere, and that's where you will work. The special settlements, from this, as far as the Soviets are concerned, are not considered exactly penitentiary in the same way that gulags are, but they're penitentiary. I mean, they mean they're 14-hour work days, cutting down the trees that will build the Soviet railroads and factories. And of course, most of the refugees are urban people, and they've never cut a tree in their life. And many people die. According to Soviet estimates, which we can assume are conservative, 25% of the people die. And I've been to some of these areas, and it's astonishing. I mean, in a way, those mass graves are still in plain sight. From there, people continue on. Basically, in 1941, we know that Germany invades the Soviet Union, and following that, most refugees are released from the settlements. The reason they are released is there's the idea that they're Polish citizens. They are released as Polish citizens, so both Jewish and Christian deportees. And the idea is that they will fight together with the Soviets against the Nazis. They will form a Polish army in exile and help the war. They're released, and most of them migrate to Soviet Central Asia. And so, and the truth is that migration is not the right word. This is really another deportation, but it's not an organized deportation in the sense that this is the Soviet Union, so you can't just decide, I'm going to go wherever I want, and it'll be great. And it's interesting because I interviewed many people, and people would say to me, you know, I had asthma, and Dad decided that we should go to a dry place, so therefore we went to Uzbekistan. But it wasn't like that. It was, when this was there, I realized that, you know, you got a deportation card. This is my grandfather's deportation card, and they told you you have to go to this and this village in Uzbekistan and live with this and this Uzbek man, and the Uzbek man had to take you, and you had to go. But there was more flexibility, and people ended up in all kinds of places in Central Asia. The situation in Central Asia, hard to believe, was actually worse than Siberia because of the heat, and because there was now a war against the Nazis. Soviet Central Asia becomes the labor front of the Soviet army, which means, in short, that the Uzbeks and the Tajiks and the Kazakhs will feed and dress the Soviet army, and if they have to die, they die. So their food is confiscated, and of course the refugees are at the bottom of the food chain, because locals at least can hide food. And so there is extreme starvation, a very extreme and dire situation, especially in 1942. It becomes a little bit better later because aid comes in and so on. And so when there is a chance for some people, some Jewish parents to send their children to Iran, together with the Polish army, which is being evacuated to Iran, my grandparents and about 1,000 others decide to send their children. So the children are allowed to go, the adults are not, unless they are soldiers in the Anders army, unless there are Jewish soldiers in the Anders army. But they were very actually few of them, ended up very few of them. And so, sorry, I went ahead of myself. And so the children are evacuated, and my grandparents and really most Polish Jewish survivors remain in Central Asia for the duration of the war. These are Jewish refugees in Bukhara. They're actually holding a Yiddish paper. And there are basically, I was just talking to some people in the audience here, Central Asia becomes a kind of land of Jews and Muslims, more or less. Not only the refugees are there, but also Soviet evacuees from Moscow and from, so for example, the Moscow Yiddish theater is evacuated to Tashkent. And in fact, they have productions of Fiddler on the Roof in Uzbek in Tashkent. And there are all these tremendous collaborations. There are Uzbek poets writing poems of sympathy with the Jews, and it becomes quite interesting and surprising. So as I said, most Polish refugees stayed there, and this is a very, as you can imagine, a very traumatic separation of children from parents. And that becomes, I think, this separation it took me a long time to realize that this separation is maybe the most traumatic thing out of this whole very traumatic journey. So understanding, and I'm kind of midway through the history, but I'll say this, and so understanding the details of what I just told you really took years. And it took years of travel and archival research, and in the book I tell those I talk about my travel, and so I traveled to Poland twice, to Russia, to Uzbekistan, to Israel. I couldn't travel to Iran because I'm an Israeli citizen. I'm also an American citizen, but my American passport says born in Haifa, Israel, so it didn't seem a good idea to go to Iran. But I had a colleague, my colleague, Salar, who was the one who kind of set me off on this journey, was researching for me, so he was able to research there. And these places are not easy to do research in because, I mean, a place like Uzbekistan is a dictatorship. You can't just travel there as an independent researcher and say, I really want to go to KGB archives, and can you please let me in? But you have to, so basically I traveled as a regular tourist on the tour of the Silk Route or something, and I had somebody, a clandestine research assistant who was helping me on the side. And that was very, very interesting. So in Russia, also those areas where people were exiled, they're still very Soviet. They're not exactly open. So it took a long time to get to archives. But also, I think what took the longest is to understand the details, to put the details together, to put the puzzle together, because what happened, I was saying that there was no story, but the truth is that there were parts of the story in different places, because collective memory, is national. It's political. It's determined by nations, and so this story, parts of the story were remembered completely differently in different places. So in Israel, this is the story of rescued children, basically. So these children arrived from Iran to Palestine on February 19th, 1943. They were the first group to arrive, the first group of Holocaust survivors to arrive as a group, right? Not all kinds of people that arrived clandestinely. Children in rags. People went nuts. There was the Jewish population in Palestine. Many people Israelis above a certain age remember the day that these children came to Palestine. School school children were released. They stood at the sides of the train and threw candies at the children. In fact, the cover of the book, these are local children looking at the refugee children. I thought, I didn't like this cover. I was fighting with Norton, but now I think it's actually very effective. The adults were standing, people were screaming at the children names of relatives in Poland. I mean, they still didn't know what was happening in Poland. But they knew that they weren't hearing from the relatives, and they were saying, did you see so-and-so? So this was a tremendous scene, and these children were received, welcomed wonderfully. Of course, the children themselves, this is my aunt at the bottom right here. And as you can see, she doesn't exactly look elated. Of course, the children themselves are completely overwhelmed. Many of them actually didn't speak Hebrew, and they have been through this horrendous experience for 3.5 years. So there is this tremendous scene going on outside, and they're very worried inside. This is taken in from inside the train. So this was Israel. Then in Poland, this is remembered as the story of the kind of evil Soviet deportations. This is all about the Soviet, how the Soviets wronged the Poles, basically. And as you can see, so this is a memorial in Warsaw, a monument to the murdered and fallen of the East. Now, as you can see, this monument has many, many crosses on it, but the fact is that most of the refugees were Jews, right? So this is a kind of complicated issue with Polish memory and Jewish memory and the competition between memories, collective memories. And this is also why this story is hard to understand, right? Because you hear different stories and you're sort of going in a lot of different directions and trying to decipher what's right and what's wrong. There is actually, you can't see it, but there is actually a little tiny Star of David in the middle of all these crosses. So it's a kind of, it's actually, this is about skewed proportions. It's not not only about sort of erasure of Jewish memory, but this is what the Poles remember, but for the Poles don't remember, they don't commemorate the fact that they were in Iran, and especially, and I'll get to it, but I'll tell you now already, most of the Christian Poles actually end up in Palestine. So this is actually a Polish high school in Tel Aviv in 1943. This is really not remembered. This is not remembered neither in Israel nor in Poland. But the Christian Poles were in Tel Aviv. They went to Hebrew University. They went to all kinds of schools. And I interviewed, in fact, one woman who was there as a child. She lives in Denver. She said to me, these were the best years of my life. I don't know what happened to that region. It was so fun. So this is something this has been erased. In Russia, the deportations are not even taught or no, really. So there are like these sort of grassroots memorials like this one, but really people don't know a lot about it, and they definitely don't know anything or very little about the Nazi Holocaust. And one of the striking moments, I think, that I had, and I think a moment that people refer to in the book a lot is when I was in this area, this is called Komi, I was interviewed by a local radio station. I mean, I came there, checked into the hotel, there were two guys sitting there, they said to me, well, these are plainclothes policemen. They knew I was there, they knew what I was doing, that's why I was saying it's very Soviet still. So I would go to these places and they would say, oh, you're the American who is researching this stuff. So finally they called me and they said, we want to interview you to a radio station. So woman, very nice, young woman, she interviews me. And you have to understand that these areas are, everybody in this area is either a descendant of a deportee or of a guard so in either the perpetrators or the deportees. Everybody, I mean, these areas would have like 5,000 native people, and then after the deportations, they would have like 50,000. And the woman interviewed me, and she said, so what do you think about Stalin? And I said, in the grand scheme of things, Stalin saved my father's life. Stalin is better than Treblinka, and where the rest of the family died. And she said, "What's Treblinka?" Which was really eye-opening, right? But the fact is that the refugees, most of the refugees, if they didn't die in the camps, were saved by Stalin because the Wehrmacht didn't get far enough into the Soviet interior to kill them. They were blocked. So when the Nazi army invaded the Soviet Union, they either killed or ghettoized and later killed by deportations those Jews who were on the border, in the border towns. But the ones that were deported were so far into the Russian interior that their lives were spared in that sense. So, so it really, my book ended up being something like, oh, I should, well, this is a grave of a little girl who's buried, this is from a Jewish cemetery in Tehran. And of course, the Iranians really don't know this story. And one thing nice thing that's been happening, I'm getting a lot of invitations from all kinds of Iranian studies programs everywhere. And to the degree that they know it, because there was an Iranian documentary movie, they don't know that they think about it as the kind of the exile of the Poles. They don't realize that there were Jews among, and many Jews even among the refugees who ended up in Tehran. And so my book in a way became a kind of, I don't know, transnational, global history of the Holocaust, kind of basically, in a way, walking between all these different archives and having them talk to each other and not being completely loyal to any national story, which took a while because I am loyal to stories. So I had to kind of shed my loyalties and to finally to understand, to try to get to the core of the story. And when I was able to shake that off, I realized, one of the things that I realized is that growing up in Israel, I guess, I had a fantasy of my father as being this rescued child, almost like being kind of airlifted from Poland to Palestine. And really what he went through and what all these refugees went through was an arduous, protracted, arbitrary path of suffering from beginning to end, starvation and diseases and terror and so on. I also understood how, I guess, arbitrary identity is, and the identity of these people were, and that's, again, this is a very simple insight, but it took me a really long time to understand that, and maybe this is also relevant of refugees today, that when you're talking about the path of refugees, every point of transit is an end point to many people. So people were released when I was in the Soviet Union, in Russia. I guess I keep thinking about it as Soviet because it was so Soviet. When I was there, I realized that many people were released from settlements and they just stayed there because they would be released and then they would say, where are we going to go? It's a war. And maybe somebody gave them a cow or something like that. And they said, okay, we have a cow, we'll have milk, we'll survive. And then they got caught behind the Iron Curtain. They became Russians. Other people stayed in Uzbekistan. This is a woman I interviewed in Samarkand. She came exactly like my father, but she met a guy. That's kind of seems to be often the case. Women meet men. And she met an Uzbek man, and she was 17, and he was 18, and she married him. And she still lives in Samarkand, and she's an Uzbek woman. I asked her, she's 90. She was sitting in this house that kind of, with the sewage was sort of around us, and I asked her, how would you summarize your life? She said, it was a good life. It started out very badly, but it worked out. And it was kind of startling to see these different fates of people. People stayed in Iran. In fact, since the book came out, I'm getting more and more emails from people who were in Iran, and I'm starting to think actually there were many more people than I thought, and especially, so again, women married Persian men and stayed in Iran. This guy here, Reza Nikpour, his mother is Polish. Jewish. His father is Iranian, and he lives in Iran. They own a shoe store. He actually has a little archive in the bottom, in the basement of the shoe store with all these documents about the refugees. And so he became Iranian. Of course, most Jews left before 70 or in 79, but some people didn't leave, and they're still there. In the early 40s, the Soviet government was actually urging local people, local Uzbeks, to adopt refugee children and to adopt and evacuee children. This was a kind of sign of great patriotism, where you created these multinational, multi-ethnic families to support and buttress the Soviet state. So this was, there was a famous blacksmith who adopted 10 children, and you can see these are Korean deportees and Jewish deportees and Polish deportees, and blended into this multicultural family. And this blacksmith was featured in Pravda and everywhere, and he was considered a great patriot. So it's very strange to discover that. Now, the children, I was just saying how traumatic the separation from their parents was, but the arrival in Iran about a week after the separation is a moment of tremendous happiness, tremendous. Iran is the first place the children or the refugees arrive at that has bread. Iran was a neutral country in 1939, a neutral country with strong ties to Germany. 1920s and 30s, German engineers are building Iran, basically. So Iran has ties to Germany, and those ties don't stop with the rise of Hitler. So Iran has ties to Germany. It has Nazi sympathizing Shiite clerics, but Iran also lets in a considerable amount of German Jewish refugees. All since the rise of Hitler, as far as Iran is concerned, they're just Germans, and they can help Iran. They can help modernize Iran. So they develop maybe 10 categories: engineers, doctors, musicians, for whatever reason, artisans, and they allow people in, and people work in Iran. And so Iran has a large German and Austrian Jewish community. In 1941, Anglo-Soviet forces invade Iran because they're afraid it'll tip to the German side. And basically, at that point, the Polish refugees come to Iran. So Iran at this point, and I'll just read you one passage. This is from a diary of a boy, a Jewish boy, 14-year-old, Warsaw-born Jewish boy. He wrote a travel diary. I was so lucky to be able to get it, and this was one of the great sources that I had. And this is what he writes on the day of their arrival in Iran. So this is translated from Polish. On the historic day of August 16, 1942, in 40 degrees and some weather, the first group of passengers leaves on the tugboat's dock, and after a half-hour sail, gets to the small port Bandar Pahlavi. Difficult to transmit in writing our first impression. Each one feels as if he is born again, has come to a place out of this world. The port's waters are littered with colorful boats. The surroundings are mowed lawns and flower beds. Rows of impressive Chevrolets and Studebakers wait for transport, and everything seems good and beautiful. Everything smiles together with the Persians, who gaze at us with pity. After we are on shore, everyone hugs everyone. And there are many of such descriptions, very, very moving. Of course, the Studebakers and the Chevrolets come from America. This is the beginning of the Land Lease and the agreement and the American aid to the Allies, and that aid is coming, much of that aid is coming in the form of military trucks. This is a Life magazine ad from 1943. It says, Studebaker military trucks like our Yanks are certainly seeing the world, and Iran is in the background. So these Polish children, in fact, my father's family they had a brewery and they had Studebakers. Studebaker trucks, and they're seeing these Studebakers in Iran, and it's this pretty crazy scene. Soon after, as I said before, the children are taken into a socialist Zionist children's home in Tehran. This is my father. I'm sorry I don't have a pointer. Right here, the one with the hair. And I'm really pleased that he has hair because the children had lice. And obviously he was able to keep his hair. And they are evacuated eventually to Palestine in a very, very crazy route because, as you can see, of course, Tehran and Tel Aviv are very, very close, very close. You just have to go. It's like 48 hours, right? But in the middle, you have Iraq, right? And Iraq is not going to let Jewish children transfer to Palestine. This is already the height of the Arab-Jewish conflict in Palestine, and in fact, Eleanor Roosevelt leans on the Iraqi prime minister, and she says to him, you know, this is a humanitarian case, these are children, and he says, we're very sorry for these children, we'll be happy to keep them in Iraq if you pay for them, but we're not going to let them cross to Palestine. And they end up taking this really crazy route through the Indian Ocean, which is full of German sea mines and so on. And this is more or less the story. I mean, how they got there, who got them to Palestine, you can read in the book, I hope. As I told you, these are, by the way, I should say that following these refugees, Jewish American organizations and Zionist aid organizations from Palestine both end up in Iran, and Tehran becomes actually a place from where packages are shipped to refugees in Central Asia throughout the war. So these are these packages. And this is my father in Kibbutz En Harod, where he will end up being raised. And so this is the story. Like 5 more minutes. I should say that although I trace my father's story and I trace Jewish refugees, but really the story is more than it's about the refugees, but it's also about the host communities, it's about refugee aid and so on, and it's also about the people who help me. So as I said, I traveled to places. Salar was my first helper, and he helped me a lot. And then other people, Magda Gowan, who actually is a Catholic nationalist historian, but for whatever reason, she ended up being my host in Poland. And Viktor Aslanov, who is kind of a mini oligarch, who was my host in Russia and was able to open a lot of doors for me. And finally, Sergei Kim, who was he's a Korean Uzbek, so Koreans were also deported, and he was my research assistant in Uzbekistan. And you know, when people help you, you realize that they also have their own stories. They have their stories. Each one of them has their own story of suffering. I mean, Salar was a child refugee of the Iranian Revolution, and Sergei Kim comes from a family of deportees. Magda's aunt was killed also by the Nazis, and so, you know, as you know, we're in a center for Jewish studies here, and Jewish history is a very heavy burden, and you want somebody else to help you carry it. Especially non-Jews, and at the same time, and that was very exhilarating and very moving and very wonderful, but also at times difficult because those narratives can sometimes clash with your narratives. I mean, Iran and Israel today, we know. The Polish narrative and the Jewish narrative is also complicated, and so the book also details my travels, my dialogues with these people. It's not a kind of We Are the World fantastical narrative, but I think it does offer the possibility of dialogue, which is difficult but possible. So thank you.
So we have lots of time for questions, and we have this mic for questions. So I'm going to move around with it, or Maya is going to move around with it, and we'll ask. So I see one question over here, and then we can.
When they have the separation in Uzbekistan, they send the kids to Tehran. But who was with these kids? Who organized them? Who managed them? I mean, they couldn't do it by themselves. And you didn't mention that there must be some people that did it. Who were they?
The children that were taken to Tehran were in Polish orphanages in in Central Asia. So the Polish government in exile sets up orphanages, and many children who are not orphans, in fact, most of the children who are not orphans, are being put in those orphanages because there's a little bit more food in the orphanages. So the children are kind of taken from the orphanages with their teachers, counselors, and whatnot. When they arrive in Tehran, they are under the care, depending on when they arrived, but initially most of them are under the care of the Polish authorities, and very quickly they come under the care of the Jewish, basically Zionist, Hashomer HaTzair counselors. The counselors come basically from among the refugees. There is one person comes from Palestine who he organizes the kind of older, when I'm talking older people in their early 20s, who were former members of Zionist youth movements in Poland. They organizes them as counselors. Basically, this is where the identity shifts, and now they become citizens of this future Jewish state, and they organize the children. So the children they're not completely alone on these boats, unless they're stowaways, which many of whom were stowaways, and they were alone as part of this Polish group.
Thank you so much for your presentation. I really enjoyed it. I'm from Iran, and I'm from the Jewish community in Iran. And I do remember my parents, sometimes they would talk about it, but again, it's a secret, right, like you say, talking about taking crayons to those young kids who lived in the tents, and also managing to take some sugar to them, which is something they really miss. Some of them had mentioned that they'd forgotten what it tastes like. And they had lice and cholera and a variety of issues, but then thanks to the Iranian Jewish community in Tehran, they were able to come to Sabbath dinners in their houses and make friends with the family members and the younger kids and so on and so forth. I got to know about this issue later on in my life, and I did study this, and I've published on this in Persian, though, so for the larger Iranian community. However, I was really blocked when it came to getting information from Iran, because like you say, it's very censored. And I'm very curious as to your friend who did some research for you in Iran. What were the sources he was able to get into? One of the reasons I'm asking this is Iran at the time was under the occupation of the Allied forces. And how much of this was permitted by the Iranian government? Who exactly was the Iranian government at the time? Because Reza Shah was also abdicated. And he was also, yeah.
We can respond to you and take other questions. Thank you.
Thank you. I would love to hear more about what you know. First of all, to your first comment, I think, yes, the local community absolutely helped these children, and I write about that a lot, and they were very moving. There's at one point they took the older children to see, if you can believe it, The Great Dictator in a cinema in Tehran. And other people were invited to Sabbath dinners. There was also a great source that I have is a memoir that was published by a rabbi, a Polish rabbi who was among the refugees. And he was basically hosted by Persian Jewish families, and he goes to these synagogues and he has all these thoughts about how they worship and how, and the differences and so on. And I think they collected clothing, and they would bring them food and so on. So that's absolutely, and that's very forgotten actually, especially in Israel, the part that the Persian Jewish community played. To your second question about sources, I didn't have amazing sources in the sense that there is no organized archive, but incidental things, interviews. I was able, for example, to find the son of the man who was in charge of the refugees on behalf of the Iranian government. His name is Asghar Parsa, and basically the Shah was deposed by the Allies. The Shah, who was the father of the Shah that we know, and they anointed the Shah that was in power until '79. He was 23 at the time, and he was considered more pro-British than his father, and he was in power. So they, again, to this question of that I started with, whether Iran saved my father, I think we can't say exactly that Iran saved my father in the sense that, yes, the Allies brought them there and they were under the care of Allies, but there are the stories of individual people who see these children are just, to me, are so moving. I mean, people really, people along the route, when they were transferred from Pahlavi to Tehran, people would see them and they would throw some stuff at them. And I have this one testimony when somebody said, we thought they was throwing rocks at us, but then we would see that it was like candy that was wrapped in like a napkin or something. And so it was very intuitive because they didn't know who they were. So there is one Persian film called The Lost Requiem. I don't know if you know that film, but by an Iranian director, and he describes, and he interviews people who say, it's like one day these ships came and these people came off these ships and they just looked so horrible, and that was what people knew. So I have people, there are people that Salar interviewed. There are some sources, Iranian documents, for example, about from the Iranian Interior Ministry about policies about refugees from before. For example, when I was talking about that they were letting in these people, and the letters are very strange. I mean, they're very inconsistent. I mean, sometimes they would let people in, sometimes they would imprison them, sometimes they would say something like, okay, if they're already here, then tell them they should go back where they came from, but if they don't want to, then okay, just leave them, but don't let anybody else in, or something like that. So, but, in the grand scheme of things, I think Iran was pragmatic, and individuals were very kind. So I tend to have a pretty positive view about the role of Iran, especially, again, we just spoke about Iraq and the role of other countries who were very resistant. There was less ideological fervor at the time.
You mentioned this whole story is about your father. Presumably he passed away, and when did he pass away in the sort of story of that? And is your mother around, and have you any other family members who you engaged in this?
Thank you for the question. So my father passed away, unfortunately, in '93, and he was pretty young. One of the most amazing things that I found out is that he passed away from Yaakov Creutzfeldt disease. It's a mad cow disease, basically. And, it's a degenerative brain disease that you get from eating spoiled cow brain. And he was, at the time, nobody knew how he contracted it because there were only 3 or 4 cases in Israel. And we now think that he probably contracted it in Uzbekistan because when I was there, I was actually, another very, very moving moment that I had, I was able to trace the exact village where they were initially, and these Uzbek farmers actually still kind of, they remember the story, they pass it on, and so they invited me to pray with them and so on. Afterwards, I became sick, but because they were like, eat, drink this water, and I had to drink it, and then I became sick. But they were really wonderful, and they said to me, we remember these refugees. Our parents told these stories of these refugees that came off their transports, and they were so hungry they ate live frogs. They really ate anything. And my brother is a physician, and we go back to my father's earlier photos, and we could see that he actually had like these neurological tics and stuff that actually suggests that this disease was dormant for a very long time. So he passed in '93. And I'm very bummed out because my aunt just died 6 months ago, and she was very important to me. She remembered a lot. She had great memory. She was really smart, and I was hoping she could read the book. I couldn't write it fast enough. My mother is alive. My mother was born in Israel. She didn't know, she lived with my father for however many years they were married. She didn't know anything at all about this, neither did I. So my siblings and my mother and a lot of other people are now discovering this, but other people, there are some Tehran children who are still alive, mostly who were younger at the time.
Thank you again. I wanted to ask you about what kind of records might be available in Uzbekistan. My story is sort of intersects somewhat. My father was sent to some kind of labor camp in Russia and in Soviet Union, and then found its way to Uzbekistan. But my mother and her family, as well as many thousands of other Jews, simply crossed the river San into Russia, and then they were sent directly in one of those 2-week journeys. But what I was wondering, whether there are any records available that basically documented who came, went, where they lived, what happened to them. Did they die? Some of my mother's family died in Uzbekistan. Are there any records of that sort of available that one can access?
The records are very poor, unfortunately. They do exist, but it's hard to access them. But the Holocaust Museum in Washington has a list of deportees to Uzbekistan, and that's the first place to search. Beyond that list, there are, if you want to know kind of the general outline of what happened, there are a few memoirs and a few books that were written by people who were there. Unfortunately, the person who was helping me, my research assistant, he's now in Korea, so he's no longer in Uzbekistan, and he was a Presbyterian minister, and as you can imagine, not the best thing to be in Uzbekistan. It's actually much better to be Jewish, who are considered indigenous people in Uzbekistan, than a Presbyterian minister who is a missionary. But those records exist. There are archives in Uzbekistan, and you can travel there and try to find out some things. Hopefully there'll be more. Again, I'm hoping that this book will push the Holocaust Museum to get more of those records. A lot of it is they have to put money in this, really. Like, they have to sort of buy that information from whoever controls those archives. There are many graveyards, and there are graves with Jewish names, and you can go there, and there is a Chabad house in Samarkand. They can trace some people, but it's very, very hard because the Uzbeks that I talked to in this village told me that the refugees who died, they just took them and buried them in the Muslim cemeteries, oftentimes without even a name. So it's very, very hard, but it may be possible. I would suggest trying to actually travel there. Uzbekistan is also just beautiful.
Thanks for this. It brought back a lot of memories. My best friend in Detroit was from one of those families. We were both born in '39, and he and his family spent the war years in Uzbekistan, but in rather different circumstances. He was with his parents and his sister. I knew his parents. His mother complained about food, but his father had been a secondary school teacher in Poland of math and physics, first in Yiddish in a Yiddish school, and then in Polish when those schools were nationalized. And he told me he loved being in Uzbekistan. He learned Uzbek quite easily, and he was a teacher in Uzbekistan. And that, I always had this kind of lovely picture of those who managed to survive in Uzbekistan, which was quite different than yours. Do you know other stories like that?
Yeah, no, I mean, what happens, 42 is when they all arrive there initially, it's a point of real crisis because, as I said, you have thousands of refugees and evacuees. All these people are descending on Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan also, and there is very little food. But after a while, first of all, American aid starts coming in. Things sort of stabilize, and I think people did find a way. Into 43, 44, there were many teachers, and people did become teachers and other things, and people studied in university, and people survived. And what's amazing about it is some people who survived in Uzbekistan, people left after the war. Many people left, so there was a repatriation agreement with Poland. People went back. Some people then came back to Uzbekistan because they left, but then they decided, well, this is actually the place where we can best survive. And they made lives in Tashkent. Sergei Kim, one of the reasons why he really wanted to help me and so on is because all his classmates were Jewish in Tashkent, and he studied in this wonderful high school, and he had all these classmates who then more or less all went to Israel after the collapse of the Soviet Union and the independence of Uzbekistan. So I think, yes, I think many people did end up making some lives. I mean, I wouldn't say it was easy, but it was possible. And especially, like you said, educators and people who had professions that they could contribute to those communities. Artists.
Because you don't mention whether your grandparents reconnected with your father and your sister. And then I was also curious about you've mentioned a little bit, but the intra-Jewish relations, because in all of these places where they traveled, there were local Jewish communities, as well as the other evacuees. So the Soviet Jews who evacuated, but there were also Oriental Jews already in Uzbekistan, and sort of what that dynamic looked like, because at least in the context where I've done research, there are often tensions that were intra-Jewish tensions about resources, about language, about culture, about access. So I'm curious about those as well, and certainly in the case of Iranian Jews and their connections as well. So I'd love to hear more about that. And then I'm going to move over here. There you go.
Okay, perfect. So first of all, about family reunification. So my father and his sister are in kibbutz in Crone. Their parents stay in Samarkand. After the war, they are repatriated. They return to Poland. I don't know exactly what happens, but they return to their hometown. I know that the brewery that they owned actually, and this is kind of a whole other story, became Gestapo headquarters, and basically was burned down by the Nazis when they left. So they return, they find nothing. They very quickly leave Poland. They end up in a displaced persons camp in Germany. They're trying desperately to get to their children in Palestine, but of course the British, who are controlling Palestine, are not letting Jews into Palestine in those years. In some cases, in very rare cases, they allow people to, under this, so they could reunite with their children, but in many cases, like, as in my grandparents, they don't. And I have dozens of letters that are really heartbreaking letters. My father writing the top British official in Palestine, and he's writing, and he was like, shall we stay separate from our parents? And writing in English, I guess somebody kind of told him what to write, and it doesn't help. So they remain there. My grandfather actually, he had tuberculosis, and he died in the DP camp. So he died in Germany. He's buried in Munich. And my grandmother, after the creation of Israel, basically in 49, comes to Israel and lives there for many, many years. So at that point, she's reunified with the children, but they've been separated for 7 years. They're now adults. And my aunt described the scene to me. It was a very complicated scene, because she comes and she's a survivor, and the children are sort of Israeli, and they've already been in the army, and they don't know what they are anymore. Are they refugees, or are they Israeli, and so on. And it's a scene I think that many people experience. So that was, this was the story. And I do think this was a very, very important and point. I mean, this is a very crucial thing, this separation. In fact, my father at some point in 46, I think, tries to enlist into the British army so he can go back to Europe to meet with his parents, basically. And luckily he stopped. So that's the answer to this. In terms of there are absolutely fascinating encounters between these European Jews and the local communities. And when I started researching this, I'm an academic, and I've been brought up on post-colonial theories, and so I was kind of ready to kind of like see how like these European Jews are looking down on these local communities. But I think the refugee situation changes everything. Everything is reshuffled, and they're really beautiful. I have an amazing scene. I mean, I don't know, I could read it, but you could read it. Basically, of this rabbi going into this local synagogue, and he's looking at the people, and he says, wow, this is Yom Kippur, and he says, for them, it's not as harsh as for us. Yom Kippur is not as harsh. In fact, they're sort of, it's like a party almost, like they're dressed beautifully, and he says something like, they treat Yom Kippur as if they know God will forgive them. And he's saying, wow, for us it's like this harsh holiday, and he says, but maybe that's kind of the right way to think about it. And so he's kind of looking at these people who ultimately, he's lost everything. He doesn't have a family. He doesn't have anything anymore. He's lost his community and his religion, and then he's looking at these people who still have that, and he's sort of thinking, well, maybe we don't need to be so harsh with ourselves. So I think at that moment, there are much more forgiving encounters. Later on, like when I interviewed, let's say, Bukharan Jews today, they said to me, yes, there are Ashkenazi Jews here, but they will never come to our synagogues. Or they don't take care of the graves of their parents, So I think that the tensions are there now, but I think the moment that I was looking at was more complicated.
We can gather a couple more questions, or we can, looks like everybody's on note, so thank you.
Thank you for coming.